What if the Palantíri, once believed to be powerful tools of wisdom, were in truth the instruments of madness that drove the greatest kings of Middle-earth to ruin? For centuries, the Palantíri were revered as beacons of wisdom. These ancient seeing stones, created by the elves, were designed to communicate across vast distances and provide unparalleled insight into the unseen corners of Middle-earth. They were meant to guide the rulers of kingdoms, to share knowledge, and to aid in the pursuit of peace. But the truth, hidden deep within the dark corners of time, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The Palantíri were not instruments of enlightenment, they were instruments of power. And with power came a terrible curse. The great kings and rulers who once gazed into these stones found themselves enthralled, driven by an insatiable need to know more, to control more, to conquer more. And in the process, they were lost. What drove Denethor to madness? What twisted Saruman, a wizard of great wisdom and power, into a traitor to his people? Why did Theoden, one of the noblest of kings, come so close to destruction? Was it the Palantíri, those ancient stones that promised truth, but instead delivered only despair? The Palantíri were meant to be tools of communication, but instead they became conduits for something far darker. What power lurked within these stones? Was it the power of Sauron, whose gaze reached through the Palantíri to bend the will of the rulers? Or was it something older, something far more malevolent, that had set the stage for the fall of the greatest kings of Middle-earth? Gandalf, always the seeker of truth, had long suspected the Palantíri held dark secrets. As he stood at the precipice of his own journey into the heart of the mystery, the questions gnawed at him. What dark power did the stones truly contain? Why were those who used them driven to madness and despair? Was it their own weaknesses that led them to fall? Or was it the stones themselves that twisted their minds, feeding on their fears, their doubts, their darkest desires? The answers, Gandalf knew, would not come easily, but they had to be found. If Middle-earth was to stand a chance against the forces of darkness that still loomed, the truth behind the curse of the Palantíri had to be uncovered. And so, his journey began into the depths of forgotten histories, into the ruins of ancient kingdoms, and into the very heart of the power that had shaped the fate of kings. Gandalf had long known the power of the Palantíri. He had seen their effects on the minds of those who had gazed into them, the hopelessness that overtook Denethor as he stared into the Palantír of Minas Tirith, the madness that corrupted Saruman's mind as he turned to Sauron's side, and the near downfall of Theoden, who had been consumed by the whispers of Saruman's manipulation. Each of them had been drawn in by the allure of the stones, each believing they could control their power. But none had understood the true cost of using them. Gandalf knew the history of the Palantíri well. Created by the elves during the Second Age, they were meant to be tools of communication, meant to help the free peoples of Middle-earth stay connected. But they were never meant for mortals. They were far more than simple objects. They were vessels of immense power, capable of bridging the gap between the physical world and the spiritual, connecting minds across distances. And they were dangerous, their power capable of both great wisdom and unimaginable destruction. The stones were originally created for the valor, the godlike beings who shaped Middle-earth. But when the elves gifted them to the kings and rulers of the land, the stones began to take on a darker nature. It was not just Sauron who could see through the Palantíri. It was also the ancient, malevolent forces that had once shaped the world, forces that still lingered in the shadows, waiting to strike. Gandalf's search for the truth of the Palantíri took him to the ruins of ancient cities, places where the stones had once been used by kings to communicate, to guide their people, to shape the future. But what Gandalf found was not what he had expected. He found ancient texts and relics, but they were incomplete. Some spoke of the stone's power, but others hinted at something darker, something that had been buried long ago. As Gandalf gathered these clues, he began to piece together a chilling story. The Palantíri had not simply been tools of communication. They were instruments of manipulation, designed to prey upon the weaknesses of those who used them. They had been created not only by the elves, but by a force far older, a force that had long since faded from memory. And this force, it seemed, had always known that the Palantíri would be used by mortals, and had crafted them with that knowledge in mind. Gandalf's search led him to ancient scrolls, hidden deep within the archives of Rivendell, where elven scholars had recorded the earliest histories of the stones. These texts spoke of the stone's power, but also of their risks. Some of the most dangerous passages, written in a language long forgotten, described how the stones had been corrupted over time. They had begun to show not just glimpses of the world, but of the minds and hearts of those who gazed into them, feeding on their doubts, their desires, their fears, and in doing so, they twisted the very nature of those who used them. As Gandalf delved deeper into the mystery, he began to see the true cost of the Palantíri's power. The stones had not been mere objects. They had been living, breathing instruments of manipulation, capable of shaping the future and distorting the minds of kings. And those who had used them, from Denethor to Saruman, had paid the ultimate price for their ambition. But the deeper Gandalf looked, the more he began to realize that the curse of the Palantíri was not just the work of Sauron. The stones were part of a far larger, darker plan, one that had been set into motion long before Sauron's rise to power. There was a connection to Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, whose influence still lingered in the deep places of Middle-earth. The Palantíri were not just tools of Sauron, they were relics of a time long past, a time when the very fabric of Middle-earth had been shaped by forces far beyond the comprehension of mortals. As Gandalf stood at the threshold of this dark truth, he realized the true nature of the Palantíri. They were not just stones, they were keys to an ancient power, a power that had been sealed away by the elves long ago, but whose influence had never truly died. The answers he sought were not in the stones themselves, but in the ancient histories, in the forgotten corners of Middle-earth, where the true curse of the Palantíri had been born. And as he prepared for the journey ahead, he knew that the path would lead him into the heart of darkness itself. The opening establishes the tone of mystery and suspense, with Gandalf beginning his investigation into the dark nature of the Palantíri. The story will delve into the historical context of the Palantíri, showing how they were originally created to aid the rulers of Middle-earth, but were ultimately twisted into tools of evil. The cursed nature of the stones will be explored through the tragic fates of Denethor, Saruman, and others, revealing how their use led to madness, betrayal, and ruin. The tension will build as Gandalf discovers that the Palantíri were not just corruptible tools, but instruments of a far-reaching, malevolent force, one that still looms over Middle-earth, threatening to undo all the progress the free peoples have made. Gandalf sat alone in the quiet of Rivendell, his brow furrowed in deep concentration as he pored over ancient scrolls. The shadows of the past seemed to stretch before him, and the weight of their truths pressed heavily upon his shoulders. Over the years, he had come to suspect that the Palantíri, the Seeing Stones, once believed to be instruments of wisdom, were far darker than the world realized. These powerful artifacts had been gifted to the rulers of Middle-earth by the elves, meant to be tools of insight and communication across great distances. But Gandalf had come to understand that the stones were not just tools, they were conduits for something far more insidious. As he studied the scrolls, a growing suspicion took root in his mind. Each account of the Palantíri's use seemed to follow a familiar pattern. Those who gazed into them were drawn into a web of despair and madness. Denethor, the steward of Gondor, had been driven to ruin by the Palantír of Minas Tirith, his mind shattered by a vision of his son's death. Saruman, the White Wizard, had used the Palantír of Orthanc, only to be seduced by Sauron's will, falling into corruption and betrayal. And even Theoden, the noble king of Rohan, had nearly succumbed to madness, his mind clouded by the whispers of Saruman through the Palantír. But why? What was it about the Palantíri that had such a profound effect on the minds of those who used them? Gandalf had heard rumors from ancient scholars, elves, and even dwarves who had encountered the stones in the past. Some spoke of a darkness that clung to the stones, a whispering influence that gnawed at the minds of their users. The more they used them, the more they became ensnared by the power within the power to see far-off lands, but also to gaze into their own souls. As Gandalf traced the threads of history, the pieces began to fall into place. The Palantíri were not mere relics of power, they were mirrors of the soul. Each stone reflected not just the world, but the innermost fears, desires, and weaknesses of its user. And the more one gazed into them, the more one became entangled in their darkness. The stones did not simply show the truth, they twisted it, distorting the mind and leading the user down a path of madness and despair. Gandalf's mind turned to Saruman. He had known the White Wizard well, once a leader of the Astari, a fellow servant of the Valor. But Saruman had fallen, seduced by the very power he had sought to control. The Palantir of Orthanc had been his undoing, allowing Sauron to reach into his mind and manipulate him. Gandalf had witnessed Saruman's descent, had felt the change in him, and now he understood the source of it. The Palantir had not only shown Saruman visions of power, it had shown him Sauron's will, bending him to the Dark Lord's desires. Denethor's fall had been similarly tragic. The Palantir of Minas Tirith had shown him a vision of his son, Faramir, dying in battle. But what Denethor did not understand was that the stone had distorted his vision, showing him a future that was not set in stone, a future shaped by fear and desperation. The despair that followed had driven him to madness, to the point where he turned against his own son and eventually took his own life. But what of the Palantiri's true origin? Gandalf began to suspect that their curse was not simply the result of Sauron's manipulation. The stones had been crafted long before Sauron's rise, and Gandalf had long suspected that they were tied to an older, more malevolent force. Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, had been the master of manipulation, and Gandalf began to wonder whether the Palantiri had been created with Morgoth's influence in mind. Had the stones been cursed from the beginning, their purpose twisted to serve the will of the Dark Lord? Or had their true nature been corrupted over time, as Sauron had taken control of them? Gandalf could no longer ignore the truth. The Palantiri were not mere tools, they were instruments of corruption, capable of driving the greatest kings and rulers of Middle-earth to madness. He had to uncover the true history of the stones, to understand the darkness that lay within them. But to do so, he would have to journey into the heart of Middle-earth's forgotten realms, to seek out the hidden Palantiri that still remained. He spoke to Aragorn, the king of Gondor, and Frodo, the ring-bearer. Both had witnessed the consequences of power and its corrupting influence. They understood the danger that lay ahead. Together, they began to plan their journey, preparing to uncover the hidden Palantiri scattered across the land. They knew that they would face great peril, for the stones were not relics of the past. They were active, still resonating with the power of Morgoth and Sauron. As the group gathered information, Gandalf's heart grew heavy. The deeper they dug into the mystery, the more they realized the true extent of the evil they might uncover. The stones were not simply relics of an ancient time. They were linked to forces that still lingered in the world, forces that could bring about the fall of all that had been built. The Palantíri were not merely objects of power. They were keys to the ancient evils of Middle-earth, evils that had never truly been destroyed. The journey ahead would not be easy. They would have to confront the darkness that had consumed the minds of the greatest rulers of Middle-earth. But Gandalf knew that the answers they sought were buried deep within the ruins of ancient kingdoms, in the hidden places where the Palantíri had once been used. And if they were to understand the full scope of the curse, they would have to face the evil that still resided within the stones, and learn the terrible truth about what had driven the kings to madness. The more Gandalf delved into the remnants of Armanelos, the clearer it became. Morgoth's shadow had never truly faded from Middle-earth. His legacy, his power, had been imprinted upon the very foundations of the city, and the Númenóreans had unknowingly allowed that evil to take root once again. As Gandalf came to this realization, a deep sense of foreboding washed over him. Sauron, though a powerful dark lord in his own right, had only been the tool of an even greater force. Morgoth, whose influence had been thought destroyed, had instead found another way to manifest. And it had been through the Númenóreans' greed and ambition that his power had been reignited. The last king of Númenor, Ar-Pharazôn, had thought to defy death, to control Morgoth's power. But in the end, it was that very power that had destroyed him. And as Gandalf stared into the depths of the Palantir, he understood the terrible truth. The Númenóreans had not merely sought immortality. They had unknowingly sought to bring Morgoth back, to release his corruption back into the world. And they had failed. The very stones of Armanelos, which had once served as tools of wisdom and power, were now the conduits of Morgoth's will, spreading his evil across the land. What the Númenóreans had intended as a gift had turned into a curse. And now, the darkness that had been locked away for so long was beginning to stir once again. As Gandalf stumbled back from the stone, the implications of his discovery began to settle heavily upon him. This was not just the unveiling of history. This was the unveiling of a terrible power, one that had the potential to reshape the future of Middle-earth. The fall of Armanelos had been the beginning, but the evil it had unleashed could continue to haunt Middle-earth for centuries to come. The danger was real, and Gandalf knew that the only way to stop it was to destroy the remnants of Morgoth's influence. But that, too, would not be easy. The Palantíri, the very vessels of this dark power, had to be destroyed, and the truth of Armanelos, its forbidden knowledge, had to remain buried forever. As Gandalf turned to Aragorn and Frodo, his face grim with the weight of what they had discovered, he understood the stakes. The legacy of Morgoth's darkness was not something that could be easily erased. It was a shadow that had been cast upon Middle-earth long ago, and it would take great courage and sacrifice to remove it. But he also knew one thing for certain. If they did not act now, the evil of Armanilos would rise once again, bringing with it the same destruction it had once wrought. They had uncovered the dark truth, and now they had to make a choice: to confront the darkness or to allow it to consume them all. Aftermath, revelation of the true depth. The journey had forever changed Gandalf and his companions. They had ventured deep into the heart of Numenor's lost history, uncovering secrets that had been hidden for millennia. What they had discovered was more terrible than they could have imagined: the dark legacy of Morgoth, still tainting the world, still threatening to rise again. But the journey had also shown them the cost of seeking knowledge, how even the noblest of kings, the wisest of rulers, could become ensnared by the allure of power and immortality. The Númenóreans had been driven by the desire to conquer death, but in the end, they had only unleashed a curse that would haunt Middle-earth for ages to come. As Gandalf returned to the west, the weight of their discovery hung heavily upon him. He now knew that evil was never truly destroyed. It could only be hidden, sealed away, or forgotten. But it would always remain, waiting for the moment when it could return. Some secrets, Gandalf whispered, were meant to remain buried forever. For the truth is often darker than anyone can imagine. And with that, the legacy of Morgoth's power would continue to linger. A reminder that even the greatest of kings, in their pursuit of knowledge and immortality, could unknowingly awaken forces that should have been left undisturbed. The story of Armanilos was a warning, and the consequences of its uncovering